the billionaire on wheelchair and the princess. In a ballroom glowing with chandeliers, laughter, and polished shoes swirling across the marble floor, one man sits alone in silence. A billionaire in a wheelchair, invisible to everyone until the princess asks him to dance. Welcome back, my wonderful family and friends. If you're tuned in and ready to dive into today's story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. Tomorrow, I'll be bringing you another exciting story you definitely don't want to miss. So, let's get started. The ballroom was a symphony of excess chandeliers dripping with crystal light, violins weaving silken notes through the air, laughter ringing out like coins tossed into a fountain. Gowns rustled like whispers of silk, polished shoes struck sharp echoes against the marble floor, and golden trays carried sparkling glasses of champagne, as though wealth itself were served on platters. But for all the brilliance and sound, one shadow lingered in silence. Macpherson sat near the far corner of the hall, where candlelight softened into shadow. His wheelchair gleamed, sleek and modern, a throne of chrome wheels and quiet mechanics. He wore a tailored suit, every detail impeccable, yet no one looked at him. Guests swept past, their gazes darting anywhere but his direction, their polite smiles avoiding his presence like it was an invisible barrier. He didn't speak, didn't reach for champagne, didn't pretend to be amused. His broad shoulders stayed rigid. His hands gripped the armrest of his chair. His jawline locked with the practiced stoicism of a man used to being overlooked. Only his eyes betrayed the storm inside, sharp, restless, dark with a depth no one dared to approach. He had been rich long enough to know what money could buy, properties, companies, even people's loyalty. But tonight reminded him of what it could never purchase: dignity in the eyes of strangers. Someone brushed by, laughter spilling, perfume trailing, and though he was less than a foot away, it was as if Macpherson didn't exist. He took a slow breath, and his chest rose with the faintest tremor. Invisibility, he thought, the richest cloak in the room. At the center of that same room, light seemed to follow her. She moved with the practiced elegance of a royal, her gown a waterfall of ivory silk edged in pearls, her hair gleaming under the chandeliers. Every eye was on her. Courtiers smiled too wide, nobles bowed too deeply, and suitors jostled for her glance. To them, she was not a woman but a jewel, a crown to be admired, a symbol of grace, a prize to be won. And yet, if one looked closely, there was something hollow in her smile. She laughed at the right jokes, offered thanks for every compliment, and swayed gracefully when men begged for a dance. But her eyes flickered with a loneliness she had mastered hiding. For years, she had been adored but not known. They saw a princess. Few saw the young woman who longed for sincerity more than jewels. As she twirled once more, her gaze swept the hall, looking past masks of ambition and desire. And then she noticed him, the man in the shadows, alone, unnoticed, unwanted. Her brow furrowed for just a fraction of a second. But in that glance, something struck her heart. Not pity, not curiosity, recognition. She knew the taste of invisibility too, though hers was masked with a crown instead of silence. She caught herself, straightened, and smiled again for the nobleman beside her, but her eyes betrayed her thoughts. Meanwhile, Macpherson felt her gaze like a flame brushing his skin. He looked up sharply, meeting her eyes from across the sea of people. For a moment, the noise of the ballroom dimmed, the chandeliers blurred, and only two figures remained: a man chained to silence and a woman shackled by duty. It lasted seconds, but to him it was an eternity. He blinked, jaw tightening, and turned his gaze away as if the contact meant nothing. But deep inside, he felt a ripple, fragile, dangerous, impossible. The orchestra swelled, dancers spun, laughter roared, And yet in two corners of the same hall, silence lingered like an unspoken secret. Macpherson unseen but burning. Rachel adored but hollow. Two souls aching for something real, their paths silently drawing closer. And in the air hung a question neither could voice yet. What happens when the invisible man and the unreachable woman finally collide? If you were in this ballroom, would you have noticed Macpherson? Or would you have looked away like everyone else? Comment below, I want to hear your honest take. The night pressed on, gilded and flawless, as though perfection itself were being staged for the world. The orchestra swelled into a waltz, and nobles rushed to the center of the floor, eager to parade themselves beneath the chandeliers. Glasses clinked, gowns rippled, and polished shoes carved neat patterns across the marble. Macpherson watched, not with envy, not anymore. Envy required hope. Instead, he watched with the detached gaze of a man who had long surrendered the thought that life had more to offer him. The hum of voices blended into one dull wave, the music a distant echo he refused to let penetrate his heart. He had perfected this routine. Sit still, speak little, leave early. At parties, he was less a man and more a piece of furniture. That was safer. No questions, no pity, no false kindness. But tonight, something shifted, because she was walking toward him. Princess Rachel. At first, he thought it was his imagination, that the glimmer of ivory silk parting the crowd wasn't headed his way. But then the crowd itself noticed. Heads turned, whispers rustled, and a ripple of confusion spread as the princess, the jewel of the evening, veered away from her suitors, away from the eager courtiers, and crossed the expanse of polished marble, straight toward the man no one dared acknowledge. Macpherson's chest tightened, his jaw set. His instinct was immediate. Look away. Pretend you don't notice. Don't let her. But then she was there. Up close, she was even more disarming. A crown of delicate diamonds rested against her dark hair, her eyes steady and unflinching, her smile soft yet alive with purpose. "Mr. Macpherson," she said, her voice a quiet melody that cut through the ballroom noise. Every head turned. Silence began to spread, pulling the sound out of the room like a tide. Macpherson's lips parted, but no words came. He felt the eyes of 100 guests piercing into him, and suddenly he was no longer invisible. He was exposed, naked beneath chandeliers that illuminated every scar, every flaw, every perceived weakness. Her hand extended. A simple gesture, yet it shattered the world. "Would you honor me with a dance?" The silence became deafening. A champagne flute slipped from someone's hand, shattering against marble. Whispers rushed in, sharp and cruel. Did she just? Impossible. The princess? With him? Macpherson's throat burned. His pride screamed to refuse, to laugh it off, to end this spectacle before it deepened his humiliation. He wanted to say something sharp, something cold enough to freeze the whispers. But her eyes didn't hold pity. They didn't carry duty. They simply saw him. His hand trembled against the armrest. He clenched his fist to steady it, his mind battling between the instinct to hide and the yearning to be human again. At last, he placed his hand into hers. Rachel's fingers closed gently around his, warm, steady, without hesitation. Gasps rippled through the ballroom as she leaned closer, as though the rest of the world no longer existed, and whispered with a smile that only he could see. "Let them stare. Tonight, they'll see the man I see." And with that, she guided him forward. The crowd parted in stunned silence as the billionaire in a wheelchair rolled onto the dance floor beside the princess. The violins faltered for a beat before picking up again, the music swelling, trembling like the air itself held its breath. He felt the burn of 1,000 eyes, yet all he could focus on was her hand in his, her calmness, her courage, the impossible reality of this moment. He wanted to speak, to ask her why. But the words lodged in his throat. For the first time in years, his silence wasn't armor. It was awe. And as the music carried them, Macpherson realized that in one single gesture, the princess had undone years of invisibility. She hadn't given him pity. She had given him something far rarer. A place in the light. Would you have had the courage to do what Rachel did, to defy everyone's judgment for the sake of one person? Comment below with what you would have done. The music ended with a flourish, but the silence that followed was louder than the final notes. The ballroom had not moved on, no. It had frozen in stunned disbelief. As Rachel gently released his hand, Macpherson felt 1,000 invisible daggers of judgment piercing his skin. He could practically hear the whispers, though no one dared voice them too loudly in her presence. The princess? With him? What does she see? What game is this? Rachel curtsied with flawless grace, masking her inner storm, while Macpherson gave the smallest nod, his face carved from stone. He forced his hands steady against the wheels of his chair and rolled himself back into the shadows. The crowd's chatter rose in a brittle hum, like glass ready to shatter. The orchestra struck up another song, but the spell had already been cast. Macpherson found his solitude again in the far corner, but tonight it was unbearable. His heart thudded in his chest, his mind raging with contradictions. Why did she do it? Was it pity? A performance? Did she want to humiliate me further? He clenched the armrest until his knuckles turned white. His pride, the armor he had built for years, screamed that he had been played for a fool. He could still feel her hand in his, light but steady, sincere in a way that felt dangerous. He hated that it lingered. He hated that a part of him longed for more. The worst part? He had allowed himself to hope, just for a moment. His voice broke the silence, low and sharp. Fool! Elsewhere, Rachel stood among her court, smiling politely, but her heart raced. Her ladies-in-waiting whispered nervously. Her cousins glanced at her with wide eyes, and a nobleman dared to ask, "Your Highness, surely it was only a jest?" Rachel's lips curved into a perfect royal smile. "I never jest in matters of honor," she said sweetly, but her insides twisted, because the truth was, she hadn't planned it. The choice had risen from her heart in a surge of defiance, in a cry for sincerity. She had seen him sitting there, invisible in plain sight, and she couldn't endure it another moment. But now, as her people whispered and the eyes of the kingdom weighed down on her, she questioned herself. What have I done? And more troubling, why does he linger in my thoughts more than any prince or duke I've ever met? Hours later, the party thinned. Laughter softened into drunken chatter. Heels clacked toward waiting carriages, and the orchestra packed away their instruments. Macpherson was among the last to leave. He maneuvered his wheelchair out of the hall quietly, his expression impenetrable. The guards opened the grand doors for him, and the cool night air rushed in. Behind him, a voice called softly, "Mr. Macpherson." He froze. Rachel stood in the doorway, her gown brushing the steps, her crown catching the moonlight. She had dismissed her attendants. She had come alone. For a moment, neither spoke. The night carried the faint chirp of crickets, the smell of roses drifting from the palace garden. Finally, she stepped closer. "I hope I did not embarrass you." Her tone was genuine, almost fragile. Macpherson's laugh was bitter, sharp. "Embarrass me? No. You gave the gossips something to feed on for months. You gave me pity dressed in pearls." Her lips parted, stung. "That wasn't pity." He wheeled closer, his voice low, cutting. "Then what was it? A performance? A moment of charity to prove how kind the princess can be? Don't dress it in silk, Your Highness. I know what I am to them." Rachel's chest rose, her breath quick. her eyes flashing not with anger but with hurt. "You think so little of me? I think so little of hope," he snapped before pulling his chair back. The silence between them was heavier than the night air. She wanted to argue, to tell him she saw him differently, but the words caught in her throat. Maybe he was right. Maybe she had only made his loneliness worse by daring to shine a light on it. And so, for the first time that evening, she let him leave. Macpherson returned home to his empty estate, the silence of polished floors and towering walls closing around him. He rolled into his study, poured himself a drink, and stared into the amber liquid without touching it. Her voice echoed in his head. "Let them stare. Tonight, they'll see the man I see." He wanted to believe it. God, he wanted to. But his scars whispered louder. "They'll never see you. You'll always be less than what you were." He slammed the glass onto the desk, spilling whiskey across papers. His reflection in the window looked back at him, strong shoulders, proud features, but always the chair beneath. He turned away. Meanwhile, Rachel sat before her vanity, crown set aside, her hair loosened. The palace was quiet, her attendants dismissed. Yet she could not sleep. She thought of his eyes, the sharpness of his voice, the tremor in his hand when he took hers. She whispered to her reflection, "Why do I feel like I failed him?" The mirror gave no answer, only the echo of her own heart. Two souls, both aching, both resisting, both too proud or too wounded to admit what they felt in that fleeting dance. The spark had lit a fire, but pride and fear rushed to smother it. For now, do you think Macpherson was right to push her away? Or was he letting his pride ruin something real? Drop your thoughts below. I'm curious where you stand. The days following the royal gala were thick with gossip. Whispers lingered in every hall of the palace and spilled into the city streets. Carriage drivers repeated it like legend. Merchants retold it with scandalous delight, and servants whispered it in the kitchens. The princess had danced with the man in the chair. Macpherson avoided the papers, though he knew the headlines would be cruel. He avoided the calls from business partners, who had likely seen opportunity in the story. He even avoided his staff, retreating deeper into silence inside his sprawling estate. But fate has little regard for pride. A royal summons arrived. The envelope, embossed with the crest of the crown, lay on his desk like a weight. Macpherson's first instinct was to burn it, to prove no one could force him into the public eye again. But his pride was met with curiosity. Why summon him now? The letter was clear. His Majesty requested his presence at the palace for a private consultation regarding philanthropic ventures. He almost laughed. Charity. How poetic. A crippled billionaire asked to discuss giving money to the kingdom's poor. Still, curiosity won. And perhaps, beneath it all, a whisper of something else. When he arrived at the palace 3 days later, the air was taut. Guards bowed. Servants bowed deeper. But none dared to speak. He wheeled himself through corridors adorned with portraits of kings and queens, each step of the journey echoing his difference. The appointed chamber wasn't filled with ministers or advisors. Instead, only one figure waited at the long table, sunlight streaming behind her like a halo. Macpherson froze at the threshold. His voice was sharp. "So, this was your idea?" Her lips curved slightly, though her eyes were weary. "No, my father asked you here. But when I learned, I asked to meet you first." The air thickened. For a moment, neither moved. The silence between them was as heavy as the chandeliers above. Finally, Macpherson wheeled closer. "If this is another attempt at charity," her tone cut him short. "This isn't about charity. It's about honesty." His brow furrowed. She gestured to the empty chamber. "No courtiers. No nobles. Just us. You may despise me if you wish, but at least give me the dignity of speaking the truth." He studied her, suspicious, wary. Yet something in her voice, the steadiness, the quiet ache, disarmed him. Reluctantly, he nodded. "Speak, then." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "That night when I asked you to dance, it wasn't to humiliate you. It wasn't pity. I saw a man who had been made invisible by a crowd too blind to notice. And I couldn't stand it." He wanted to scoff, to mock her naivete. But her eyes didn't flinch. There was no pity there, only conviction. "You don't know me," he said. His voice was rough, uneven. "Then let me," she replied. McPherson turned sharply, wheeling away to face the tall windows overlooking the gardens. His reflection in the glass seemed to sneer back at him, proud, scarred, alone. "You think it's that simple? That you can choose to see me and suddenly I'm a man again?" His hand gripped the wheel until it trembled. "I've spent years being stared at, whispered about, pitted. You can't undo that with one dance." Her footsteps approached softly until she stood beside him. "Maybe not, but I can start." The words lodged in his chest like an arrow. He hated how much they stirred something he had buried, the hunger to be known, to be believed in. He exhaled sharply, trying to steady himself. "Why me, princess? You could have danced with anyone. Any prince, any duke. Why me?" Her answer came quietly. "Because when I looked across that room, you were the only one not performing. The only one not begging to be seen. And yet the one who deserved it most." The silence that followed was unbearable. He wanted to believe her, and that frightened him more than her words. Suddenly the doors burst open. A messenger rushed in, breathless. "Your Highness, a storm has collapsed one of the roads leading to the orphanage district. His Majesty requests immediate aid." Rachel turned sharply, already moving. Then she looked back at him. "Come with me." McPherson blinked. "What?" "You've built half the city with your fortune. You know logistics better than anyone in this palace. I can't do this without you." And just like that, the choice was forced upon him. Stay and cling to pride or follow her into the storm. He cursed under his breath. But then, with a push of his wheels, he followed. The carriage jolted violently as rain pounded against its roof, lightning splitting the sky. Inside, McPherson and Rachel sat across from each other, water dripping from her gown, his eyes dark with thought. They didn't speak at first, but the storm filled the silence, thunder rumbling, wheels grinding through mud. Finally, she whispered, "Do you hate me?" He looked up, startled. Her voice was fragile, stripped of the princess mask. He swallowed, the answer tangled in his chest. "No, but I don't know how to trust you." Her gaze softened. "Then let me earn it." The carriage rattled on, binding them together in storm and silence. And for the first time since the gala, McPherson felt the faintest crack in the wall around his heart. The storm raged as the carriage rumbled through the night. By the time they reached the orphanage district, the road was slick with mud and collapsed beams blocked the way. Children huddled under makeshift tents, their cries mixing with the thunder. McPherson's instincts took over. His voice, sharp and commanding, cut through the chaos. "Clear the south path first. Reinforce the weaker beams with rope. Not wood, it'll splinter. Move now." The guards hesitated at first, surprised that a man in a wheelchair was giving orders. But the precision in his tone left no room for doubt. Within minutes, the workers and soldiers fell into rhythm under his direction, moving rubble efficiently. Rachel watched from the edge of the storm, awe flickering in her chest. He was different here, alive, purposeful, more than the shadows he hid behind. When at last the danger eased, and the children were carried into shelter, McPherson wheeled himself beneath a broken archway to catch his breath. Rain slid down his jawline, plastering his hair to his forehead, but he looked like a man carved from steel. Rachel approached quietly. "You've done this before." His eyes darkened. "Too many times." She crouched beside him, her gown soaking in the mud, unbothered by the ruin of her royal image. "Tell me." For a long moment he said nothing. Then, against his better judgment, he spoke. "I wasn't born into this chair," he began, his voice low, heavy. "I had everything once: power, mobility, freedom. I ran empires with a handshake and traveled the world like it was my playground. I was reckless, proud." His jaw tightened. "Until the crash." Her breath caught. "My car. Late at night. I was drunk, angry, careless. I thought I was untouchable. The accident spared my life but shattered my spine. And it killed the only person who ever loved me without condition." His hands trembled on the wheels, his voice raw. "My fiancée. She was beside me. She didn't make it." The storm seemed to hush around them, as though even the thunder bowed in silence. Rachel's throat tightened, her chest aching at the vulnerability in his words. She reached for his hand but stopped just short, afraid he would recoil. "I swore after that night," he continued, staring at the rain-soaked ground, "that I'd never let anyone close enough to suffer because of me again. Better to be alone. Better to be invisible." Silence hung between them, thick with grief. Rachel finally spoke, her voice trembling. "You blame yourself." His laugh was bitter. "Wouldn't you?" Her eyes glistened. "I blame myself every day." He looked at her sharply. "For what?" She hesitated, then lowered her gaze. "For being born into a crown. People think it's a blessing, but it's a cage. Every smile, every word, every step. It isn't mine. It's the kingdom's. I've never been allowed to choose for myself. And the one time I did," her voice cracked, "I fell in love with a man my family disapproved of. They ended it. For him, it was ruin. For me, it was chains. I never forgave myself." McPherson's eyes softened. He hadn't expected her to bleed, too. She looked up at him, her voice breaking. "So yes, I know what it means to blame yourself for surviving, while the people you love pay the price." For a long time, neither moved. Two souls broken in different ways, yet tethered by the same haunting truth. Finally, McPherson whispered, "You shouldn't be telling me this." "Why not?" she asked. "Because I'm not safe," he said. "I destroy the people who care about me." Her lips curved faintly, though her eyes shone with tears. "Or maybe you save them." The storm outside began to calm, rain softening into a drizzle. Workers' voices carried faintly in the distance, the crisis slowly resolving. But here, beneath the broken archway, something fragile and unspoken began to take root. Later, when the children were safe and the roads secured, McPherson and Rachel returned to the carriage. Neither spoke for most of the ride. The silence was not the same as before, not sharp, not hostile. It was heavy, intimate, filled with words that neither dared to voice yet. At one point, Rachel leaned her head against the window, exhaustion pulling her into a half-sleep. McPherson turned his gaze toward her, studying the delicate curve of her face softened by moonlight. For the first time in years, his thoughts were not only of loss. He caught himself, clenched his jaw, and turned away. But deep inside, a dangerous thought lingered. What if she truly sees me? The storm had passed by morning. Pale sunlight slipped through the clouds, gilding the soaked streets in soft gold. Carriages rattled through the repaired road, and laughter, fragile but real, rose from the orphanage yard as children played in the puddles. McPherson stood at the edge of the scene in his chair, watching as Rachel knelt in the mud without hesitation, her gown ruined beyond repair. She was teaching a little girl how to braid her doll's hair, her laughter ringing light and unguarded. He had seen queens, CEOs, tycoons, people who wielded power like weapons. But never had he seen someone so powerful look so human. And never had he wanted so desperately to keep watching. When she noticed his gaze, she rose and walked toward him. Her cheeks flushed from the cold air, her hair disheveled by the rain. She looked nothing like the flawless princess of the ballroom. She looked real. "You should smile more," she teased gently, stopping in front of him. His brows lifted. "I don't smile." Her lips curved mischievously. "You just did." He scowled, but she wasn't wrong. He had felt it, however faintly, tugging at the corner of his mouth. Later, when their duties at the orphanage were finished, the two of them found themselves walking, or in his case, rolling along the palace gardens. The roses still held drops of rain, glittering like jewels. Rachel slowed her pace, letting the silence between them stretch, not heavy this time, but comfortable. "When you gave those orders last night, I saw the man you used to be, strong, certain, alive." His jaw tightened. "That man died in the crash." She glanced at him, eyes warm. "I don't think so. I think he's still here. You just don't let him out often." He looked away, unsettled. No one had spoken to him like that in years, not with pity, but with stubborn faith. They paused at a marble bench beneath a canopy of vines. She sat. He positioned his chair beside her. For a while, they simply listened to the wind stirring the leaves. Finally, Rachel said, "You know, I envy you." He turned sharply. "Envy me? For what?" "For being able to walk away from the crown when you wish. For having a choice even if it means isolation." "I've never had one." Her voice softened. "Do you know what it feels like to have the whole world admire you, yet not a soul truly know you?" His gaze dropped to his hands. Too well. Their eyes met, the truth laid bare between them. Two people trapped by different prisons, yet longing for the same freedom.
The cafe smelled of coffee, pastries, and the faint tang of rain seeping through the door. The space was intimate, quiet, a bubble removed from the world outside. For a few minutes, neither spoke, letting the silence settle around them like a shared comfort. Flora kept her hands wrapped around her cup, watching the steam rise, trying to calm the fluttering of her heart. Michael broke the silence first. "You're soaked," he said softly, noting the water clinging to her hair and coat. There was no judgment in his tone, only concern. He removed his coat and draped it over her chair, a simple gesture that carried weight she couldn't yet define. "Thanks," she murmured, her voice small. "I wasn't expecting anyone else to be caught out in this mess." "You weren't expecting me, I suppose," he said, his lips tugging into a small, knowing smile. There was teasing in his tone, light and effortless, but beneath it lay an unmistakable warmth. Flora's fingers tightened around her cup. "No. I wasn't," she admitted. Her honesty felt dangerous, like a delicate crystal she wasn't sure she could protect. Yet something in his gaze, the calm steadiness, the quiet attention, made her want to risk it. Michael leaned back, studying her as the rain pelted the window beside them. "Sometimes," he said slowly, "the things we don't expect are exactly what we need." His words were simple, but the subtext was loaded. He wasn't talking about the storm outside. He was talking about her.
And yet, for the first time in years, he didn't shut that voice out. The bond between McPherson and Rachel had grown slowly, like a candle flame sheltered against the wind. But in the palace, candles could be snuffed out in an instant. It began with whispers. By the time a week had passed since the storm, those whispers had sharpened into daggers. The princess in the gardens with the crippled billionaire. She lingers too long in his company. She risks the crown for a man broken in both body and soul. The court had always been cruel. But now their cruelty had purpose, to protect the kingdom's image. One evening, Macpherson arrived at the palace for a private meeting with the king's council, only to overhear a conversation he wasn't meant to hear. Behind the thick doors of the chamber, a nobleman's voice hissed, "Your Highness, this flirtation must end. The people won't accept a princess lowering herself to such pity." Another sneered, "A man bound to a chair cannot stand beside our crown. Imagine the airs he cannot give. Imagine the weakness it would signal." There was laughter, cold and cutting. Macpherson's stomach twisted. He wheeled back from the door, every cruel word burning into his chest. But the worst cut of all came when he heard her voice. "Rachel, I understand your concerns," she said carefully. His heart froze. "I would never shame the crown," she continued. "I only meant to be kind." The words struck him like a blade. Kindness. That was all he was. A charity case. A gesture. He didn't wait to hear more. He turned his chair sharply and left, the wheels grinding against marble, his throat burning. That night, when Rachel sought him in the gardens, he was waiting, but his eyes were darker than she had ever seen them. "You said I wasn't pity," he snapped the moment she approached. "But tonight I heard the truth." Confusion rippled across her face. "What truth?" He laughed bitterly. "That I was nothing but kindness to you. A royal gesture. A moment of entertainment for a bored princess." Her eyes widened. "Macpherson, no. Don't lie to me." His voice cut the night air. Birds startled from the hedges. "I heard you. I heard you tell them you would never shame the crown. That I was nothing more than a kindness." Rachel's face crumpled. "You don't understand. I had to say those words. If I defied them, they would have..." "They would have what? Stripped your crown? Please." His voice was sharp, his pride a blade. "At least you have something to lose. I already lost everything that made me a man." Her tears spilled, shimmering in the moonlight. "Don't say that. You are more of a man than any I've known." He shook his head, jaw clenched. "No. I'm a reminder of your cage. You're chained by duty and I'm chained by wheels. We were fools to think we could be anything more than shadows to each other." She stepped forward, desperate, reaching for his hand. "Macpherson," but he pulled back, his voice breaking. Don't touch me. Don't give me hope when you've already thrown me to the wolves." The silence that followed was unbearable. Only the fountain's trickle filled the air, mocking the wreckage of what they had built. Finally, she whispered, "If that's truly what you believe, then perhaps we are fools." Her voice cracked on the last word, and with trembling steps, she turned away. Macpherson's chest heaved as he watched her retreat, each step pulling something vital out of him. Pride held him frozen. Pride, his last shield, even as his heart begged him to call her back. But he said nothing. That night, he sat alone in his vast study, a single lamp casting shadows across the walls. He poured whiskey, but it tasted like ash. He stared into the fire, but all he saw was her face. Her tears, her eyes, the way she whispered his name. He pressed his palms to his face, choking back a sound that hadn't left his chest in years. "Asobi." In another part of the palace, Rachel lay across her bed, her crown discarded, her pillow wet with tears. She whispered into the darkness, "Why wasn't I enough to make him stay?" And for the first time since she was a child, she felt utterly powerless. Two souls, broken, divided not by fate but by pride, fear, and the cruelty of the world around them. The bond they had built, fragile and precious, lay shattered. The palace was alive with light and music that night. Another gala, another illusion of perfection, but neither Macpherson nor Rachel attended. Instead, they faced their solitude in opposite corners of the world, mirrors of each other's pain. McPherson sat in his penthouse study, the city sprawling in glittering silence beneath him. The glass of whiskey in his hand had gone warm, untouched. His reflection stared back at him in the window, a man hollowed out, sharp lines etched into his face. His wheelchair a cruel reminder of everything he had lost. But it wasn't the chair that gnawed at him tonight. It was her. He replayed her words in the garden again and again. I only meant to be kind. He clenched his fist until the veins in his hand stood out, trying to crush the echo. Kindness, he muttered bitterly. That's all I was. And yet, another memory fought its way through the bitterness. Her laughter in the gardens, her ruined gown as she knelt with the orphans, her voice whispering, "You don't have to hide from me." He pressed his hand against his chest, as though to still the ache. Pride told him to let her go, to stay silent, to bury the bond before it consumed him. But the silence was unbearable. At the same hour, Rachel stood barefoot in her chambers, her ball gown abandoned in a heap of silk. She wore only a simple nightdress, her crown locked away in its jeweled box. The weight of duty pressed heavier tonight than ever before. Her father's words still rang in her ears. You must think of the kingdom. The princess does not belong to herself. And yet, she remembered the way McPherson had looked at her. Not as a princess, not as a duty, but as a woman. For one fleeting moment in his presence, she had belonged only to herself. Tears burned her eyes. Why did I let him go? She whispered into the darkness. Because of fear, because of pride, because choosing him meant defying everything she had been raised to obey. But the thought of living without him, of returning to the cage, smiling through endless balls and betrothals, felt like suffocation. Her hand trembled as she picked up her diary, the only place she had ever dared write the truth. She opened to a blank page and wrote only one line. Do I choose the crown or my heart? The ink bled as her tears fell on the paper. Hours passed. The city slept. Both remained awake, haunted by the same question. Pride or vulnerability? Near midnight, McPherson pushed back from his desk with sudden force, his chair rolling against the polished floor. He couldn't breathe in that room anymore. The walls pressed too close, the silence too loud. He wheeled himself to the elevator, down through the marble lobby, and out into the night air. The city's chill bit into his skin, but it grounded him. For the first time since the crash, he wasn't running from pain, he was chasing something. Her. At that same moment, Rachel rose from her bed, unable to stay still. She crossed to the balcony, staring out at the city lights in the distance. Somewhere out there, he was awake too. She felt it in her bones. Her breath caught as she whispered into the night, "If you reach for me, I will answer." She didn't know if the wind carried her words, but she closed her eyes and let her heart send the message anyway. The next morning, the palace buzzed with news. The princess had refused a royal proposal brought forth by the council. Gasps echoed through marble halls. Scandal rippled across the kingdom. But Rachel didn't care. For the first time in her life, she had said no. And somewhere across the city, McPherson canceled every business meeting, every facade of power he clung to. Pride had chained him long enough. Now he would choose vulnerability. The decision hung over both of them like dawn breaking after a long storm. They didn't know what would happen when they saw each other again. They didn't know if the world would tear them apart. But they knew one thing with aching certainty. Neither could bear the silence any longer. It was time to choose. The palace was alive again that evening. Another ball, another show of grandeur. Chandeliers blazed, the orchestra tuned, and guests filled the gilded hall with the same cruel whispers that had once cut McPherson to the bone. But tonight was different. Tonight, McPherson wasn't invisible. He wasn't a man hiding in the corner of the ballroom, waiting for the night to end. He wheeled himself forward with steady hands, dressed in a tailored black suit that fit him like armor, every movement deliberate. The crowd parted with murmurs, some in shock, some in disdain, but he didn't falter, because across the room he saw her, Princess Rachel. She stood radiant in ivory silk, her hair swept back like a crown of stars, but her eyes were no longer caged. They were alive, burning with something fiercer than duty, choice. Their gazes locked. The crowd, the orchestra, the endless chatter, all of it faded to nothing. Rachel stepped forward, her heels clicking against marble. Guests gasped. The council whispered warnings, but she didn't stop until she reached him. For a heartbeat, they simply stood facing each other, the tension unbearable. Then, her lips curved into the faintest smile, the same smile she'd given him on that first night. "McPherson," she whispered, her voice carrying despite the silence of the room. "Would you honor me with another dance?" Gasps rippled again, this time louder. He stared up at her, his throat tight, pride and pain warring for the last time. But then, slowly, he extended his hand. Not trembling, not reluctant, but steady. And she took it. The orchestra faltered, unsure, until the conductor lifted his baton with trembling hands. Music filled the air, the same waltz that had played on the night everything began. The crowd pressed back, leaving the floor open, unwilling but powerless to stop what was unfolding. Rachel didn't care about their stares. She cared only about the man before her, the man who had hidden behind shadows but had chosen her tonight. She knelt beside him, resting one hand lightly over his, and whispered so only he could hear, "Let them see. Tonight, I choose you." His chest tightened, tears burning unbidden at the corners of his eyes. And for the first time in years, he didn't fight them. Together, they moved with the music. Not a perfect waltz, not flawless steps, but something more powerful. A rhythm born of courage, defiance, and love. The ballroom stood frozen, nobles and courtiers speechless, as the princess and the billionaire in a wheelchair became the center of the world. From the shadows, a child from the orphanage peeked into the hall, her doll clasped tightly to her chest. She smiled when she saw McPherson, whispering to herself, "He's not invisible anymore." The words, though unheard, seemed to echo through the air. When the music ended, Rachel did not step away. Instead, she turned to the watching crowd and spoke, her voice steady, regal, unyielding. "This is the man I choose," she declared, her hand still clasping his. "Not for his wealth, not for his name, but because he sees me, because he makes me free." The silence broke into chaos. Gasps, protests, outrage. But behind it all was something stronger. Awe. McPherson squeezed her hand gently, his voice low but resolute. "You'll lose everything." She looked at him, her eyes glowing. "No, I'll gain everything." And then, before the council could object, before the whispers could crush them, she leaned forward and kissed him. The ballroom erupted. Some turned away in fury, others in shock, but none could erase the image now burned into the kingdom's memory. The princess and the broken billionaire, united in defiance and love. Later that night, when the crowds had dispersed and the palace was quiet, McPherson and Rachel found themselves in the gardens where their bond had once shattered. This time there were no harsh words, no pride, only silence soft enough to cradle them both. "You know," he murmured, staring up at the stars, "I thought I destroyed everything I touched." She smiled, her fingers brushing his. "You built me instead." His heart swelled painfully. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe not in pity, not in charity, but in love. The story did not end in perfection. The council would fight. The nobles would sneer. The world would not change overnight. But as they sat together beneath the starlit vines, hand in hand, one truth was unshakable. They had chosen each other, and that choice was stronger than any crown, any will, any chain. Love had come at last, unexpected, defiant, and unstoppable. And it was enough. Would you have chosen love if it meant risking everything, reputation, crown, even pride? Share your thoughts below. I'd love to hear what you would choose.
Thank you so much for watching my story all the way to the end. Your support means everything. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts.